This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. You know I just love to sneak some of these combo episodes into my podcast series. Look, at 600 plus episodes, weeks and weeks of listening, not everybody started with me in 2012. So I have to reach back in the archives and pull some of my favorites forward to the future. Because I like to think that everything I do in this show works out to be timeless. I mean, that's my objective. That's what I'm trying for. Maybe I fail, maybe I succeed, but that's what I want. I want that timelessness. You know, one of the criticisms that podcast hosts either hear or should hear, not enough female guests. Now, that in itself doesn't really make sense. Why should you be worried about whether the guest is male or female? Oh, come on. The vast majority of my guests are male. Many shows don't have females on at all. Now, maybe I have certain biases to content, certain types of content. And I think that's what leads me to this combo ep today, featuring three of my favorite guests, Sally Hogshead, Kathleen Eisenhart, and Amy Herman. Sally, prolific author, best-selling author. Her classic book, which I just still love to this day, Fascinate. Kathleen Eisenhart at Stanford. Her book, Simple Rules. You already know from a trend-following perspective where I'm going to go and why I like that. Last but not least, Amy Herman. Her book, Visual Intelligence. Now this is outside the box thinking. I am wide open. Send me the recommendations. If there are ladies that I should have on this show that I have missed, and I know there are, please let me know. Now, as you know, I have certain content biases, so I'm probably not going to have some types of stuff on this show. But you can see across these three episodes, in this combination mega episode, you know what I like. You know the content that makes me excited. I hope you enjoy this mega episode with Sally Hogshead, Kathleen Eisenhart, and Amy Herman. Today on the show, I have Sally Hogshead. She's an American author, speaker, former advertising executive, as well as the chief executive officer of Fascinate, Inc. I came across Sally a few years ago with her book, Fascinate. Her newest book, How the World Sees You, Discover Your Highest Value Through the Science of Fascination, is out now. And for the first 500 people, yes, this sounds like a sales pitch, but it's a really cool assessment that Sally has developed. She's developed an assessment, a personality assessment that shows how the world views you. I took it. Very cool. Her book's very cool. Very, very wise lady. I'm going to put the link to this free assessment in the write-up for the podcast. And the special code, not surprising, is Trend Following. All one word, Trend Following. I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you'll indulge me for just 30 seconds or 60 seconds, I'll tell you how I ended up coming to speak with you today.
Oh, yeah.
So 2-3 years ago, I'd read this great book by Seth Godin called Linchpin. Mm-hmm. First 30 pages, I'm like, okay, this guy's got it nailed. This is how the world is today. He knows exactly what's going on. These two friends of mine, two ladies, one worked for me, named Michelle worked for me, and her friend Erin worked for a private jet airline. And they knew I liked this book. And then Erin had met somebody, a client on the jet, and he was reading this book, Fascinate. And they're like, oh, we must give this book to Michael. They did not read it. They did not do anything. They just knew, oh, the guy's like, yeah, if he likes Seth Godin's Linchpin, he's going to love this. They give me the book. Okay. I dig in. I start reading this fascinating story about why women at lap dancers, strip clubs make more money at certain points in time of the month. So I went back to my two friends who are probably a little more wholesome than I am. And I start saying, listen, there's this fascinating story in this book. And they both look at me aghast and they're like, oh my gosh, what did we give this man?
And what does this have to do with branding?
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, the new book definitely builds upon that. And one of the things that I tried to do is to be smart. Like the strip club story is very polarizing. I talk about a black swan. It's so on the fringe that for the person who is truly who I want to talk to, they love stories like that. And for other people, it can sometimes become too polarizing.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that as I was reading. I was like, well, not everybody will have the same sensibility where they can accept that. They might get lost there and not get to the most important messaging.
Yeah. You're right. They lose it for the whole. But that one of the things that I loved so much about that book was the research process of uncovering these kind of Malcolm Gladwellian stories and making these connections. But I had to discipline myself not to do that on this one. Have you ever had that happen that you become so immersed in a project you're working on, a story that you're telling, that you have to be careful to make sure that it's also accessible for other people because you would get so involved in those fringe element stories?
Absolutely. The fringe elements are the best. I mean, I remember my first book, I was trying to figure out in a trading book, how could I get the line from Dean Wormer in Animal House about being fat, drunk, and stupid was no way to go through life. And I was trying to figure out how can I get this into the book? Of course, there's no real reason for it to be in there, but it was important to me.
Yeah. Yes.
Hey, listen. Okay, let's jump right in. So I took the Fascination Advantage survey, which to me was really interesting because I'm actually qualified to administer the Myers-Briggs instrument.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes.
I have your report in front of me, by the way.
Do you? I'm an INTP?
No, your Fascination Advantage report.
Oh, okay. The Myers-Briggs side, I'm an INTP.
Ah.
Yeah. So.
And that fits with mystique and innovation that you're observant, you're intellectual, but you also have a strong creative streak.
Let me do this, though, before we even get into this. I haven't really introduced where we're going to go today and why this is all important and your expertise. First off, this power of fascination. Why don't you describe the kind of initial elevator pitch about fascination and what you have done, and perhaps give a little bit of background as to how you even got to this point to put all this cool information together.
Mm-hmm. Fascination is an intense focus. And when you're fascinated by someone, you are completely immersed in what they're saying. You're listening to them without being distracted. You're not feeling doubt. You're not feeling confusion. And it's critical to be able to fascinate your listener, not just to get their attention or interest them. It's critical to be able to really grip their full focus so that they're not thinking about their iPhone. They're not thinking about their next meeting. When you talk to a prospect or an employee or a customer or a client and you're fascinating them, in that moment, you're able to really create a connection with them. And as things become more distracted, more competitive, more commoditized, it becomes even more important to be able to do this immediately and to know how your personality is most likely to do this. About 10 years ago, I began studying why do certain companies or people or messages fascinate us and other ones don't earn our attention. And what I found is there are very specific patterns. There are 7 different categories of things that fascinate us. And in my last book, Fascinate, I described how brands use these 7 different advantages, these 7 modes of communication. But then what I noticed was everybody kept coming up to me and saying, tell me about me. What makes me fascinating? How do I do this? And so 4 years ago, I began studying individuals and teams and why are some people naturally more effective when they communicate? And I discovered that all of us in our communication, we're using certain patterns that we're not even aware of. And that our listener is responding to us or not responding to us based on how we build our messages, how we shape our communication. So I created the Fascination Advantage assessment, and we've since measured 300,000 professionals, and we found that the high performers inside of teams, inside Fortune 100 companies, inside small businesses, the high performers have something very specific in common. And that is they understand how to communicate in a way that immediately adds value to their listener. Every time you communicate, you're either adding value or you're taking up space. And if you're adding value, people want more from you. They want your opinions. They're attracted to you professionally. They're hungry to hear more of what you're going to say. They take action on your words. But if you're just taking up space, you're kind of like human spam. People start to block you out. They filter out what you say. They don't read your emails. They don't listen to your opinions in meetings. So the key is to understand how is your personality naturally primed to add value to your listeners so that you can instantly impress and influence them so that your words are heard and remembered and acted upon.
Okay, how did you go down this, quote, fascinating path? What were you doing at 25? What were you doing at 20? What happened? How did this happen? And where did you get the word fascination? What an awesome word as a person that thinks about brands and book titles and stuff. What a great word, fascinate.
I was originally studying 10 years ago. I shifted over from advertising to in writing a book to understanding why do we pay attention to certain things, certain companies, certain people and not others. And I wanted to understand exactly what that was. And as I was looking in a journal, I found this word fascination. And turns out this is really cool. Talk about being attracted to an obscure story. The word fascination means to bewitch or captivate or hold captive so that the person is powerless to resist. It's ancient Latin. So originally it was about shepherds in the field. And the shepherds wanted to make sure that their sheep didn't get distracted and wander off. So they talk about this concept of fascination. How do you make somebody captive to listen to what you're saying? And the word has all kinds of amazing connotations throughout time. It was seen as an evil force in Constantinople and Mesopotamia, because when somebody is fascinated, they're powerless to resist. So I did about a year of research, finding what is it that fascinates us? And why is it that sometimes we don't know why we're fascinated by a slice of chocolate cake or a Britney Spears video or a TED speech? It's almost as though we lose our powers of decision. And Sigmund Freud describes this beautifully. He refers to fascination as a bondage of love. I drew upon my advertising background. For the first half of my career, I was an advertising creative director. I created national television commercials for brands like Nike and Coca-Cola and Target. And I took the experience that I had with understanding how to shape perception and how do you tap into something that is a natural inherent advantage within a message, within a brand. And how can you steer that? And how could you use that in your career? And I discovered that a traditional personality assessment is based on one thing, and that is, how do you see the world? Myers-Briggs, StrengthsFinder, DISC, Colby, they all show you how you see the world, but they don't show you the opposite. They don't show you how the world sees you. So to understand how the world sees you, we have to go outside psychology and we have to look at branding. Branding tells us how the world sees you. Coca-Cola knows how its consumer sees it. A hardware store knows how its customer sees it, but we as individuals don't necessarily know how the world sees us. So that's what I developed in this new batch of research around this book, How the World Sees You. It shows you exactly how the world sees you at your best.
It was really, really interesting because you're spot on as somebody, as I mentioned, that taken a little bit of training to administer the MBTI years ago. And I guess it's interesting that I know that I'm introverted. It's interesting to know that I'm perceiving versus judgmental, or judging. But what can I do with it, really? It's more, and it always seemed like to me, and I only did it kind of as a lark, but it always seemed to me that people that were really into it were like building these office structures where they would walk around with these little 4-word labels or 4-letter labels on their lapel. And it's like, it started to seem a little bit just cultish to me. And I'm not trying to be mean to anybody or any other operation, but I thought the flipping that you've done, the flipping of how does people see, and then being able to kind of look at assessment and forcing yourself, which I was doing last night, reading my assessment. Oh, wow, that's really accurate. And oh, wow, I've wasted a lot of time doing something that I shouldn't waste my time on. And oh, wow, maybe I should be focusing on what's brought me to the party to begin with.
and what people really value in you, and what you're already doing right, so you can do more of it. You've articulated it beautifully. Myers-Briggs and a traditional personality assessment does a great job of telling you how you see the world, so that helps to inform you what kind of perspective you're going to have on other people. But it doesn't tell you what other people are most impressed and influenced by in your natural personality. If we look at what great brands do three things when they build their communication. First of all, they don't focus on how they're similar to other brands. They focus on how they're different. Yet in the workplace or in our jobs, as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as employees, we tend to focus on how we're similar or better. And that's where this whole concept of strengths comes from. If you focus on your strengths, you're trapped in a hamster wheel trying to outdo other people. But if you focus on your differences, you have a lot more room to carve out a very specific place so that people can associate certain advantages with you. The second thing that brands do that's really powerful is brands understand their differences can be very small and subtle. A Gillette razor is very similar to a Schick razor, to a generic razor. It might only be a 1/1,000,000th of an inch difference, but yet that 1/1,000,000th of an inch is a competitive advantage. And in the same way, your personality has certain very specific differences, which I outline in your Fascination Advantage report. And when you focus on those differences, you can get a competitive edge over other people who are vying for your prospect's attention, or trying to get in front of your customer, or trying to lead your employees away.
Sally, as I'm sitting here, I'm looking at my survey, my assessment, and maybe not that I want to talk about myself, but since you're the pro, you're the expert, and you're looking at mine, and we want the audience and this is not, we've never talked before. It's not like a sales pitch or anything, but this is damn interesting. So I highly recommend my people to go do it. So why don't we go through mine and maybe let you explain, I think maybe people get a kick out of it, explain what it means that I am a secret weapon, and that my primary advantage is mystique, secondary advantage, innovation, and my dormant advantage is trust. And clearly, how many archetypes are there?
There are 49 different archetypes, and they're organized according to 7 different advantages. And if you like, I can go through, and using you as an example, I can describe.
I'm the guinea pig. I'm the guinea pig. Kill me, eat me. Dude, what you got to do?
Kill you. I'm going to give you kind of some of the personality steroids. So what I found in my research that I was describing earlier, there are 7 different types of advantages, 7 modes of communication. For example, the passion advantage is all about building immediate relationship. People with a primary passion advantage, in other words, people who naturally communicate using the passion advantage, love to be able to meet new people. They use a lot of body language. They make eye contact. They tend to be very emotive when they talk. They're very sensitive to what other people are thinking and feeling. They like to get emotionally engaged quickly. On the other hand, typically, they tend to not be great with details. They're not strong with follow through. They tend to not make decisions rationally. They make them by their gut. So there are advantages, and then there are also pitfalls that come with each one of these. Another example would be the trust advantage. Trust personalities, people with primary trust, tend to be great at systems. They like to do the same thing over and over again. They come into work at the same time every day. They're very predictable. They're practical. They're reliable. They're consistent. This makes them really good in jobs such as an administrative assistant, or somebody who's going to be in charge of a process that's going to go for many years into the future without changing. On the other hand, their pitfall is they're really not good at creativity. They tend to not like change. They're uncomfortable with chaos. You wouldn't find them in a startup environment, for example. So now shifting this over, let's take a look at you. Mm-hmm. Your primary advantage is mystique. Mystique personalities are observant. They're intellectual. It's almost like they're chess players. They're able to listen and observe very closely, take in a lot of complex information, and then sort it through, putting everything in order. And this gives them a huge competitive advantage when other people are making snap decisions, or other people are throwing random information against the wall and discrediting themselves, or being erratic in how they behave. A mystique personality, on the other hand, sees everything that's happening and then processes it to be able to make sure that they're putting their chips on exactly the right place. Very, very strategic advantage. Your secondary advantage, meaning on the score of the 7, the one that you score next highest, is innovation, and innovation is all about creativity. So people with a primary or secondary innovation love to brainstorm solutions to problems. They don't get stuck in a rut. They're able to give a proliferation of ideas. So if you and I were working together, your two key advantages are primary mystique, secondary innovation, meaning you're going to listen carefully to everything I say, but then you're going to be able to come forth with all kinds of different options and solutions and variables, and to be able to see things in a very complex, rich way. Your archetype, when you combine your primary with your secondary, you get an archetype. Your archetype is named the secret weapon. And I love working with secret weapons. And here's why.
You just got very breathy there all of a sudden. I got frightened.
I have a special relationship with secret weapons. Secret weapons to me are the most, they're intellectual chameleons. They are able to go into a situation, whether that situation is a cocktail party or a client meeting or a blog, a podcast, and they're able to very quickly ascertain exactly what's going on with the other people in the room and then adjust to make sure that they get the best possible result. Secret weapons are rare. And in business, they're outstanding problem solvers because they tend to not draw the attention to themselves. They put all of their energy into figuring out what are options that I can present here. And so on the surface, they tend to have a very buttoned down appearance, but on the inside, they're teeming with all different types of ideas. And so if you and I were working together, the way in which you're going to add the most value is through three adjectives. The three adjectives of the secret weapon, your top three adjectives are nimble, unassuming, and independent. Nimble is the ability to generate all different types of solutions. Unassuming means that although you're very creative, you're not going to be the one with the nose ring and the red mohawk and razzle dazzle. You're not going to churn a lot of drama or fuss. And your third adjective is independent, and that means that you work extremely well when you're being able to be the intellect behind the scenes. You're not the person who needs to tap into your team constantly. You don't need a lot of hand holding. You really like to be able to be an entrepreneur and stay focused on what you want to do and then join the team when you're ready to. So when you're working, Michael, when you're working with people, imagine you go into a high pressure communication situation like a pitch, like a presentation, a meeting, maybe a difficult conversation with a client. Can you give me an example of a time when you want to play your A game?
It's really weird. I don't know if this is answering your question, but if somebody gives me a stage, like in the last 12 months where I was afforded a stage in Beijing and Shanghai, and they say, here's 750 people in the audience that don't speak English, and they're all going to wear headphones, and you have to talk for 30 seconds and then wait for us to translate, and this is all broadcast live. And I actually feel more comfortable walking into that than maybe I do sitting alone sometimes. That kind of is, that's easy. It's comfortable.
It's comfortable for you. When you feel comfortable, you feel more confident, and you probably feel like you can put your ideas together in a more organized and effective way, don't you?
Yeah. Comfort is huge. I think because look, just from a pure distraction standpoint, if our minds are all distracted and we have all kinds of stuff going on, you just can't create, you can't innovate, you can't think. And so it is very key, at least from my perspective, to have a clear deck, an open mind, and really be able to focus.
When you get in that state of focus, that's a state of fascination that you feel. It's almost like being in a state of flow, that you feel energized, you feel confident, you feel like your ideas come more easily. We've all had these moments where you're having a conversation with a friend, or you're standing in front of a boardroom and you're making a presentation, or you're trying to explain an idea to a colleague, and it becomes perfectly clear for you, and it's very energizing. It's an amazing feeling when you can communicate yourself in exactly the right way, whatever that means for you. And this is what happens when you understand how the world sees you at your best, that you can stop floundering around trying to figure out how you should stand and what words you should use and how do you communicate your ideas and how is the other person thinking about you in that moment. It gives you a clarity and a focus so that you can find those situations that you're most primed to be able to get your listener into a state of fascination so that you're connected with them and you feel a sense of ease. They feel relaxed. You're able to front load your value by speaking in a way that gets an actionable result for them. And they perceive you as being more confident and more authoritative. And for you, the example that you just described is a perfect example. When you're on stage and you're putting your thoughts together, even though that seems like a really challenging environment with the translation and having that happen in real time, for you, because you have primary mystique, and we were saying that it's very intellectual, it's very complex, it's able to handle data in an unusual way, piecemealing and strategizing your communication is really easy for you. But for a lot of people, that would be their communication nightmare. That would really throw them off.
It's kind of fun to have the crazy stuff happen. Hey, but listen, go into to the dormant advantage, because you've made me sound like all nice and sweet and wonderful and all these things. So why don't we stick the red hot poker in it and lance my midsection and let me bleed out now with my dormant advantage of trust.
Is bleed out a reference? But do you remember Hot Zone? It was a book. It was
yes,
a book
I read it. Yeah.
Yeah, was it? Yes. So you can think about your dormant advantage is of the seven, it's the one on which you score lowest. And your dormant advantage is exhausting for you to use. If you think about it like quicksand, there's certain types of communication situations that you dread, and you're not going to win in them. And it feels very effortful. It's discouraging. It's demoralizing. For some people, people with a dormant mystique advantage, remember you have primary mystique. For people with dormant mystique, they don't want to think in a structured way. They want to be able just to say what they're thinking while they're thinking it. They don't want to withhold anything. They don't want to have to organize their thoughts before they jump right in with both feet. You, on the other hand, are very different than that. You have a different way of communicating. Your dormant advantage is the trust advantage. And it's the same one as me. I have a dormant trust advantage too. Remember, before I was describing, people with primary trust advantage are highly structured. They like patterns. They like to do the same thing over and over again, and they get comfort from being predictable. And so they're great with very highly process-oriented rules system, like an accountant would have primary trust. You and I, on the other hand, we tend to resist doing the same thing over and over. We like change. We embrace being able to invent a new path. So if I came to you, Mike, and I said, Mike, I'm really stuck. I need help coming up with a new idea. What would it feel like for you if I came to you with that kind of a challenge? Help me figure out a new path. Would that feel like wellspring, or would that feel like quicksand?
I don't know. As long as you were open, we could throw everything on the table and we could toss around ideas and debate, and that you were truly open, that there wasn't this fake openness, that there was something you really wanted to make it better, and you really didn't have your mind already made up, and I was just there for a dog and pony show.
Yeah, if I was really there for an action instead of just randomly discussing it. For you, that would feel very productive, and you would have a high chance of winning. You have a really high chance in a situation when I come to you like that and I say, I need some new solutions. You can bring forth your A game effortlessly, predictably, over and over again. It feels really natural for you. On the other hand, if I said, Michael, I've got this spreadsheet, and I just want to replicate it over and over again all day long. Can you help me with that? What would that feel like for you?
I'd ask you to pass me the gun so I could kill myself.
Yes. So there's some situations where you're naturally suited to win. The situations that you're naturally suited to win are all described by your primary and secondary advantage. If somebody is looking for independent solutions that with high degrees of variables and a lot of strategy, then for you, that's going to feel like something that's very, very easy for you to over deliver. On the other hand, doing the exact same thing over and over in a rigid structure, almost mathematical way, is going to be totally exhausting.
Let me dig it on that point though, because it's really interesting. As I start this conversation mentioning Seth Godin's book Linchpin, and I'm guessing that you probably share a lot of the beliefs there. And what he's mapped out, frankly, is that perhaps our lives are essentially sprung from being independent entrepreneurs ultimately. But a lot of people, isn't that the path though? The path of being, look, I've spent the last year and a half in Asia. And many of my Asian friends, I was just in Tokyo less than a month ago, and in Tokyo, I would think for 99% of the population, it seems like the primary advantage would be trust. It's very orderly. Everything's very orderly. But aren't we facing a tipping point at some point in time where what we have seen as order for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that this more nimble, entrepreneurial minded way, Aren't we moving that direction? Isn't that the real opportunity for people today? Because I'm not trying to criticize the idea of people saying that their primary advantage is trust. These are not necessarily, I'm guessing, are not necessarily meant to be one's better than the other. But if you really would be objective about the playing field that we look at today, the business playing field, the career playing field, it sure seems like that trusting a system that allows you to just do the same thing every day, that opportunity is going away.
Yes. And in a situation or a marketplace in which everybody's really creative, trust becomes even that much more rare. So it becomes that much more coveted. And here's an example of what I mean. As part of my research with 300,000 professionals, we went inside high performing companies and we looked at their high performers. We went inside AT&T and GE and Cisco and Unilever. And we measured what was happening on their teams and what was happening with their leaders. And we found that there were specific things that distinguished the high performers from everybody else. And the number one thing that we discovered they were doing is they have a personality specialty of some kind. In other words, they provide a specific benefit. People who were detail oriented were really detail oriented. People who were able to bring a team together and rally the team and motivate people to get bigger results, like to meet a quota or to over-deliver for a certain client, were able to really bring the team together. So success in any kind of an ecosystem has a lot to do with what makes you different than everybody else. Remember, we were talking before about brands. High performers understand that they need to be worth more than they're being paid, and that the ways in which they're similar to other people are far less valuable than the ways in which they're different. And so high performers identify the ways in which they're different, and then they use that and apply it and double down, focusing on it, almost exaggerating it. So within an environment, whether it's with a team or in a commoditized marketplace, you don't want to be like your competitor or like your coworker or other people in your industry. You want to be as unlike them as possible. It's not about focusing on your strengths. It's about focusing on your differences and then leveraging that, amplifying that so that you can not only carve out a place for yourself in the market, but so that you can specialize in some specific way.
I keep wanting to say the cliche that this is fascinating. Hey, let me, we only got a few minutes left. I want to jump around to, I made some notes here of just things that I loved in your work. And I think they're kind of like fun examples to get people thinking. I mean, I highly recommend checking out your written work. And I think we've got something where people will be able to take, at least a certain number of people could take the F score through. The fascination advantage.
You have a magic code to get to them.
It's terribly secret. You picked a hard one.
So would you like me to introduce that?
Well, no, we'll bring that up at the end. I want to give a couple few points out here that I just want you to kind of run over, because it's almost like the strip club story that I think it'll get people thinking your way of thinking, even though it's not necessarily connected in a through line. And one of the things that I would love for you to talk about is you're now talking about not being a commodity, right? And in your work, you talk about your friend, David Scott. And I thought it was so brilliant what he did. Here is, David Scott, you type it in Google. Look, I've got a cool last name. Okay. Not cool, but it's a good last name, kind of like yours. Are there any other Sally Hogsheads? I don't think so, right? Are there any Michael Covels? Not really. So it's great for Google. I mean, if anybody has any idea how Google works, it's just fantastic. David Scott, not good for Google. So how did he solve it?
David Scott was one of about 3 million other David Scotts, including a senator and an astronaut. So he had a problem. He wasn't being found on Google, and this was his expertise, being online PR and building an online brand. And so he started using his middle name. And his middle name is Meerman. And for those people who are listening, they probably have heard this name before, David Meerman Scott. And just by making that subtle shift, he was able to not only rise in Google ranks, but to differentiate himself in a very literal way. In the same way, in this new book, How the World Sees You, I described there are parts of your personality that you can accent, that you can highlight to differentiate yourself. For example, if you're very restrained, you're not a personality that throws yourself out there immediately, you're discreet, well, then you don't want to try to be the person who's the life of the party, walking in and, glad handing and backslapping. Instead, you want to build a reputation for being skillful, for being stable, for being hardworking, level-headed, whatever traits come naturally to you. And this is what's described in the fascination advantage. When you know what words describe you perfectly, it allows you to make sure that you're focusing on that every time you communicate, not just the words that you're literally using in your LinkedIn profile or the about section of your website, but it's also knowing how you're most suited to win so that you can be more confident and your listener can hear what you're saying and not just listen to you, but be fascinated.
You have 8 kids?
My husband and I have 8 kids together. Yes. They range from 10 to 24.
So I have a friend of mine who's a hedge fund manager, and he has 8 kids too. And he had 8 kids in 8 years, eight total calendar years.
Holy moly.
Yeah. That's not necessarily related to our conversation, but I just have to.
It's the little obscure factoids.
Yes, you can already tell that's who you're dealing with. I have another couple here before we wind down and let people know about the F advantage. This I just love. If you're not generating a negative reaction from someone, you're probably not fascinating anyone.
Listen, we live in a commoditized environment. People are distracted. Your competition is better than it ever was before. If you're not focusing on people to grip their attention and to deliver something that nobody else can, then you're at severe risk of being perceived as a commodity, the same as everyone else. And when that happens, once you're not adding value and you're taking up space, you have to take your prices down. You're not going to create loyalty. You're not going to get referrals. On the other hand, if you talk really specifically in the way that's most natural and authentic to you, for your personality, and you hone in on those core differences, then you're going to attract certain people who are going to become rabid fans. And then other people are simply going to fall off and they're not going to be attracted to your message. And that's fine. You want to be a little polarizing. It's kind of like the difference between pistachio ice cream and vanilla ice cream. Vanilla appeals to everyone. You can be the vanilla of your category if you have the biggest budget or if you're the most famous. But if you don't have the biggest marketing budget or you're not the most famous, then don't be vanilla. Instead, be pistachio. Pistachio doesn't try to talk to everybody. It tries to only talk to a few people, but it talks to them really, really well. So people don't just like pistachio. They crazy love pistachio. On the other hand, a lot of people hate pistachio, and that's fine. They would never buy it in the first place. You don't want to be the vanilla of your category. Instead, find that those pistachio elements of your personality so that you can grow your business around that, grow your career around it.
Basically, what you're telling me is it's a good thing that I have extreme hating on my Amazon reviews. It's a good thing that it seems like shut-ins that are probably in their mom's basement that are cursing me out on Amazon reviews, that's a good thing, and that I'm probably, if I didn't have those, I would have no success. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, exactly. One of my clients for a year was Jägermeister. People either love Jägermeister or they hate it. And the reality is that the more you dislike Jägermeister, the more likely you are to drink it, because Jägermeister is not selling itself on the basis of a great taste or low price or convenience. Jägermeister is selling itself on the basis of a specific type of experience. As I was doing research for Jägermeister, I talked to a bartender who said, there are 2 types of drunk. There's drunk, and then there's Jägermeister drunk. And so when people order Jägermeister, they're not looking for deliciousness. They're looking for kerosene. You're drinking battery acid, and that's the whole point. It's an experience that everybody's going to bond together over, like the Iditarod, and people are going to remember it. So in the same way, you don't want to build your business around the ways in which you're similar. You don't want to be the vanilla. You don't want to try to see what other people are doing and then be better than them. Instead, figure out what can you do that nobody else can do. And there are ways that you naturally are suited to be like those high performers I described, and to deliver a specific benefit, a specialty. And that's what I describe in how the world sees you.
It's been a long time, but Jägermeister is something to the effect of the inappropriate removal of clothes would be what that should be the catch line on Jägermeister. Okay, Sally. So the F score, you're going to give some folks that are listening the opportunity to go ahead and take this. And like I said, like we've never talked today, and I just took mine yesterday, but it is really interesting, and I highly recommend it. It's got me thinking more about how I should position myself, frankly, not to sound too academic about it, but I mean, it definitely gets you thinking about how the world perceives you.
Yeah, it gives you the words that you can actually cut and paste right into your LinkedIn profile, or if you're making an introduction at a networking event, or you're doing a proposal, somebody's saying, why should I work with you? You can just cut and paste the language that's in the report and put it right in there. Plagiarize me blatantly. And here's how to do that. The Fascination Advantage is normally $37, but Michael's making it available for free for you for a limited amount of time. And it's, you can access it here. Go to howtheworldseesyou.com/you, YOU. howtheworldseesyou.com/you. And the code is trend following, all one word. It's not case sensitive. Trend following, all one word. And when you take the assessment, it's 28 questions, takes about 3 minutes. You can do it on your phone, but it's based on a custom algorithm that identifies how people see you at your best, so that you can understand how do you focus on what you're already doing right. And immediately you get a 15-page report that goes into great detail on how you compare to the average population. What are your primary and secondary advantages so that you can focus on those? What's your dormant advantage so you can avoid that? And how do you use that to build a more successful career?
It's very cool stuff, Sally.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can cross paths sometimes soon in the future. I would enjoy chit-chatting. It's we've already been chit-chatting, but I I love your stuff. And I like I said, I've not seen the second book, but the first book, Fascinate. Actually, you've done 3 books now, is it?
Yes, I did. My first book was 10 years ago. My second book, Fascinate, was about 4 years ago. And then this new book, How the World Sees You, just came out. Just came out a week ago. In fact, this is still shiny new information. It was just number 2 New York Times, number 1 Wall Street Journal bestseller.
Oh,
and
that is very cool.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
That is very cool. And you're going to have quite a few people wanting to see how the world sees you, for sure. So.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you for talking with me. I have to tell you, I love your work, and there's so much overlap between the things that you find fascinating and understanding that conversations and business and trends can go in really unexpected places. So I have loved getting to know your work and learning how the world sees you, Michael.
Sally, it was good chatting, and you've probably got a full house to go take care of. No, hold on, they're all in the house still, yes?
They're not.
No.
Thank goodness.
Okay. Hey, Sally, listen, take care and best of luck with the book. Hopefully it's not number 1 yet, right?
It's weaving back and forth. So,
it has made 1.
I appreciate being able to share it with everybody and sharing it with you.
Sally, thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Everything is complex. Your solution must be complex. The world is complex. That's the bill of goods that you've been sold. Here's the dirty little secret. The best and the brightest, the most successful, have developed fantastically simple rules for our ever more complex and chaotic life. Simple works best. You can see this in all walks of life. Of course, in my world, in the trading world, absolutely 100% simple. Now, the philosophy, the psychology, the system itself, there might be quite a bit of depth, but the execution in any endeavor, any discipline today, you're going to find your great success with simple rules. My guest today is Kathleen Eisenhart from Stanford. She is the co-director of the Stanford Technology Ventures Program. Her latest book, Simple Rules: How to Survive in a Complex World. It's funny because right when I announced that I'm going to have Kathleen on my program, it's amazing how many people have reached out to me and said, "Oh, I'm reading that book right now. That's a great book. I love that book." Today, Kathleen breaks apart some of the key issues, the core concepts in her study of Simple Rules. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kathleen Eisenhart. We're going to dig into the content of Simple Rules, but I know you've been at this subject for a long time in papers before your book. Give me a starting point, a genesis, the beginning, how this started to happen with you and your co-author. How did it all start?
This actually started, I was working with one of my former doctoral students, Shona Brown. We were looking at computer companies in the late 90s or so, and we were trying to figure out why some had could do product after product after product really successfully, and others couldn't. It was a global study, and we saw that the companies that had way too much structure, too many rules, could really efficiently get out the wrong product. On the other hand, we also saw that the companies that had no rules at all were having a great time, but they couldn't get any products out either. We started to realize there was this middle of a small amount of structure, semi-structure, simple rules was really kind of a differentiator. And so that was the original set of ideas that Shona and I came up with. Shona was then a McKinsey consultant and then went on to be senior VP of operations at Google before their IPO and then after their IPO. So she started using some of the ideas at Google. I was still in academics, and then Don Sull and I hooked up, and we said, we're seeing this not just in computer companies. We're seeing this phenomenon in top executives, in top firms, and in successful people in regular life. That they're able to distill what they're doing into a small number of rules, and then to be very focused on the one hand on those rules, but also very flexible because the rules weren't very many. So that's the genesis, if you will.
I started to notice going through your work. I immediately thought to myself, okay, I know you have reached out to or looked at other works of other people in academia. For example, I immediately thought of Spiros Markadakis. I immediately thought of Gerd Gigerenzer, and boom, I saw them both in your index. I realized that there's this many people touching on this subject area, but kind of going in their own different directions. But you brought this more into the world of business. But even though it's more than just business, it could be investing, entertainment, all different types of fields where simple rules beat the complexity.
Right. And that was what we started. Don Sull, my co-authors at MIT. What he and I started to realize, it wasn't just business. It was lots of places, and also I think we both didn't really want to write a business book. I'm in academics. I've written lots of academic papers, done some book things, and none of my friends care what I do. And so I got to thinking, I want to write a book that my book group will read, and a book that's a broader book. And so that's really why we went to a book that has sports and entertainment and investing, and when we give talks, talk about raising our kids, going on diet. We're trying to pull together some ideas, but also talk to that broader audience.
Why don't you just define simple rules? We talked about it generally already, but why don't you define simple rules from your perspective, something simple that people can immediately wrap their arms around?
Okay, simple rules are rules of thumb. It's probably the easiest thing to think about them. But simple rules are cognitive shortcuts that save on effort and save on attention. And the popular way of calling them is rules of thumb. Maybe to expand that definition just slightly for your listeners, simple rules means three things. It means simple rules are simple, 2, 3, 4, 5, something like that. Secondly, simple rules are unique to the person in the situation. So you may have rules for investing given your situation, and I may have different rules given my situation. And then thirdly, simple rules are focused on a particular activity. It could be choosing what to eat. It could be what to invest in. It could be how to hire. It could be which firms to partner with. But it's focused on a particular activity.
Let me give an example, a more complicated example to let you talk about for a moment, and then we'll work back to some other ideas. I can look at a situation right now. I can look at for the last in the investing world, the currency markets, interest rates. The Federal Reserve has gotten so much press in the last 5 or 6 years. Much of the work the Fed does is based off these very complicated econometric models. But we can all go back, and I don't necessarily mean this to pick on anyone, but we can look at the comments from many of the people before the crisis, and they had really no idea that there was going to be a crisis in 2008. And then the same people are involved in trying to fix it after. And it makes you wonder. It's like, well, gosh, these are some brilliant people with these fabulous models. At least we come to think that they're all fabulous models. But the results on some of the biggest things in our life, at least in markets and money, the complication doesn't seem to get us the results we need.
Yeah, that's I think a really ironic observation, and I think the idea behind simple rules is that when you have a complicated, interconnected world like the Fed overseas, if you model it with complexity, in fact, you just get models that don't predict very well, because what you're doing is essentially modeling the past. At least one of the big reasons, and so I think that may be why Janet Yellen, whether you agree with her or not, has actually comes out now with fairly simple rules. In fact, they are very simple. One of them is she's going to raise interest rates when unemployment drops below 5% and inflation goes over 2%. What is, I think, useful about that is that she has essentially simplified her own job, but also communicated to investors, to business people, and so forth, her plan of what's going to happen, and so you can do your own planning because you understand what she's going to be doing. Now, it may be that she should be changing those rules at this point, but certainly for a couple of years anyway, we've all been able to know that's the target. That's when the Fed's going to raise. So I think that's I think an illustration of both how simple rules can simplify an economy and how that simplifies an economy in the way that the rest of us can also go about our business.
You've got a great example in your work. Talk about the South Pole in around 1912.
Nobody ever asked me about that one. That's the South Pole expedition of Amundsen versus Peary. Amundsen being the Norwegian explorer and Robert Peary, the British one. What's interesting about that one is Peary had what one would have thought were all the advantages. He had Arctic experience. He had fantastic equipment. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of men, and he ends up with an expedition where he has 3 modes of transportation: dogs, ponies, and some motorized sled, none of which end up working at the end, and he ends up having to actually pull his own sled, run out of food, and so on. By contrast, Amundsen has a much simpler set of rules that are around basically focusing on traveling with dogs. And so he's very focused with a small team using dogs pulling sled travel that he observed in the Arctic, and now he's in the Antarctic, so in the South Pole, and has a couple of simple rules about dogs, one of which is always have a lead skier because dogs want to follow someone. The second rule was stop every hour because dogs need a break, and the third was go consistent number of hours every day because dogs like to be in a rhythm. So it was really all about the dogs. And so it was a very simple set of rules. They also had some simple rules around eating and some other things, but mainly the dogs were important. In contrast, you have Peary he has dogs and he has ponies and he has other things. Plus the British pride themselves on knowing all about dogs, but they know about hunting dogs, not Arctic dogs or Antarctic dogs. So I think it's a great illustration of simplicity conquering complexity in a novel situation.
There seems to be this desire or this drive amongst a certain part of the population that complexity there's more and more school and just really brilliant people pursuing these more and more complicated type systems. But what about the ego? Have you found something in your work, the types of people that can let go and just say, you know what? Simple's okay. I know I can't control it all. Simple will get me to where I want to go better than your complicated. Can you kind of compare and contrast the personalities that might choose simple versus not simple?
Michael, you're asking me some great questions. Nobody ever asks me this. Yeah, I think I can, actually. I think people who complicate things, there are probably 2 kinds of complicators. One are people who are risk averse. So they just want to lock everything down so there's no problem. If they plan for every contingency, they've got it covered. The problem is you can't predict the contingencies necessarily. So there's the risk averse people. There are also the people who make a living out of being complicated. So one might think of
you're being very diplomatic about that.
I don't want to jump on lawyers, but I think we don't need lawyers if the laws are simple, but they aren't. So I think we have lawyers, accountants, lobbyists, all make livings, particularly in the government sector, on having a complicated world that only they can decipher. So I think it's both risk aversion and making your living off it is why you see a lot of rules. By contrast, I think people who are more, let's say, simple in the right way, simple in the sense that it's not that they have no rules, but they have some. I think are people who are more risk taking and probably more strategic, because great simple rules are strategic. They aren't just. That's why your rules are not my rules. That's why, let's say, you're in your mid-30s and you have no money, your investing rules might be different than mine. If I'm in my 50s and I have a lot of wealth, I might be investing completely differently than you are and have different rules. So simple rules are strategic. And then there's the people with no rules who sort of enjoy just saying, well, we just let go with it. And they don't get much done either. So there's really three kinds of people, if you will. There's the risk-averse, make my money off it. There's the more risk-takers, strategic people. And then there's just people who just like to wing it. And the wing-it people don't do too well either. But maybe they're probably more fun to be with than the risk-averse ones.
Let me expand on your bringing up attorneys, complication. That can easily lead to a conversation about politics and something like the tax code. And I think everyone, regardless of political stripe in America, looks at the tax code and just says, what in blazes have we got here? This is what I find interesting about the simple rules concept. Everyone knows the United States of America tax code needs help. But are we ever going to get to simple rules in the tax code because of politics? Because there is an incentive for various political stripes to, and this could go both ways, to use the tax code to their advantage for political gain. And so even though someone like yourself might map out a structure, a simple rule structure that can make sense for the vast majority of people, there's a chance we might not ever get there when it comes to simple rules for the tax code.
I think you're right on all counts there. Everybody wants a simpler code, well, almost everybody, but we don't seem to be able to get there. And I think there are special interests that there are the risk-averse people who feel you have to legislate everything and legislate risk out of life, which we see something in California, basically an over-regulated state. You also see the special interests giving loopholes to various industry groups, for example, or other kinds of groups. It seems like it's not going to get simple until the Republicans and Democrats maybe start working together. And while I certainly don't think of myself as a Tea Party Freedom Caucus kind of girl, there's something to be said for their message of less government. Maybe not much to be said for their inability to compromise, but certainly that message. So if both parties could get into a sense of, let's have leaner government, save money, give it back to people, I think we'd all be better off.
There's something to be said, too, for also when an individual or a company uses simple rules, and maybe those simple rules are not intuitive at first, but to see the results from simple rules. I don't know if you have any examples that come to mind, perhaps somebody that was swayed to go to simple rules or didn't start with simple rules, and they made the transition and they have that aha moment where they all of a sudden just realize, wow, this is so much better than where we were.
Yeah, I think actually an interesting one recently is Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors. General Motors, I used to be on the General Motors Science Board, and I got a good chance to see General Motors, and it's a very complex organization, big, complicated organization, and I think she's trying to simplify it. One of her most recent attempts is looking at the GM dress code. GM dress code was 5 pages long, and sort of had a contingency for factory workers. If you were on the racetrack, wherever you were, GM specified what you should wear. She simplified that down to dress appropriately, just 2 words: dress appropriately. End of story. And I think she's a person who's trying to slash bureaucracy. Don and I have also worked with a number of companies, probably in the $100 million to $1 billion range, helping them use simple rules. So one of them was a company that was innovating in dental products, and they were having they had award-winning product, but they were having difficulty selling it, in the sense they would call a bunch of dentists and they'd get maybe a 2 or 3% hit rate of dentists even wanting to talk to them. So they developed some simple rules of what an ideal dentist is. Tried those out. It was rules like an ideal dentist is 35 to 50, owns his or her own practice, is innovative. Well, it turned out those simple rules didn't work very well because it was hard to tell how old somebody was. It was hard to tell whether they own their own practice. So it was hard to implement the rules. So they they realized in the course of trying to develop rules, there were two simpler rules. One was call on dentists with innovative websites. That was a signal that you had a dentist that had the money and that had the interest in doing something cutting edge. And then the second rule was around credit scores. Check out the dentist's credit scores. So what they were trying to get was dentists who paid their bills, who were innovative. Their hit rate went up to something like 60-70%. So amazing difference. Obviously, revenue up, costs down in terms of they lower their sales costs. So that was just an example of a relatively small company with a huge impact in going to simple rules.
As the son of a dentist who's been practicing for over 45 years and still practicing and fits all the criteria that you talked about, the good things, except I keep telling him, man, your website is terrible. He's like, oh, my younger partners.
So maybe we missed your dad in those rules. I don't know. But
you can't. But the idea is you're not going to get everybody under the curve. Not everybody under the bell curve is going to be in the simple ruals.
Right. But what you're going to do is you're going to massively improve your probabilities. Is the idea. So you've now made it much more likely you're calling on the right people and they want to hear your message.
You know, as a guy that grew up playing a little baseball, I love that you brought up the example with Billy Beane. Why don't you talk about the Oakland A's? It's not too far away from Stanford, a little hop, skip, and a jump. If a lot of traffic, it could take you many hours to get there. But why don't you talk about Billy Beane? And, you know, here we know a guy that, for those that have read Moneyball, very high-end statistical analysis of players and how he selects players. But he had a lot of old school scouts, and he gave those old school scouts some pretty simple rules to try and take into account everything he was thinking about. And again, it wouldn't be perfect, but why don't you talk about the simple rules he used?
Billy Beane's a great example. He's the general manager of the Oakland A's, as probably many of your listeners know. He came up with the Moneyball ideas, one of which was pick players who have high on-base percentage. And that was a break away from picking players, for example, who have high batting averages or hit a lot of home runs. He said, no, it's all about on-base percentage, not making outs. Started picking players on that basis, became successful doing that, among other simple rules, but that was a simple rule. What the movie that was the Brad Pitt movie about Billy Beane really focused in on those rules, as did the Michael Lewis book. What was not shown in either the movie or the book was the fact that Billy Beane went to simple rules, but he also increased the number of old line scouts. So what he was trying to do, I think, was more efficiently use those scouts. So give them a sandbox of here's where we're playing, and then let them use their talents to choose within that sandbox. So that's the first thing that really happens there is yes, he goes to statistics, but he also uses baseball guys who then can look at talent and don't waste their time looking at talent that basically the team's not interested in.
He had little things too, like no high school players and no kids that drink a lot.
No high school players, no kids that drink a lot were some of the rules. Another one was around pitchers who throw strikes, because base on ball is just giving the other team a free pass. What happens, though, which sometimes happens in simple rules, and it certainly happened for the Athletics, is other people started to figure out what the rules were. So you see the Boston Red Sox copying the Oakland A's rules with a bigger payroll. And they win their first World Series in, 80, 90 years, something like that, in 2004. So I think the really interesting next part of the Oakland A's story is, okay, the original rules were great, but now everybody copied them. What are the new rules? And you started to see the Oakland A's switched into new rules, for example, around platooning lefties and righties. one of their new rules, which then started to get copied again, and now they're back, I think, trying to reinvent what the rules are again. But it's kind of an interesting saga of how Billy Beane has kept reinventing the A's with new simple rules.
Since you've got so many cool examples and we're already in athletics, I should take you back to Stanford, and you've got a great example. You talk about the Stanford strength coach. Why don't you explain what happened there? I think it's a great example.
Yes, the Stanford football team, for those of you who follow football, was really miserable for a long time. The only good thing about that as a Stanford fan was it was easy to get a seat. Now it's hard because Stanford has is now ranked number 8 in the country, been a top football team for probably the last 5, 6, 7 years, 8 years maybe. And big part of that turnaround, one part was Jim Harbaugh, but the part we focus on in the book is Shannon Turley, who's the strength coach. And what Jim and Shannon realized at Stanford was it was very hard for Stanford to get players who were both Division I players who could play at Alabama and who also could get into Stanford and meet the admissions criteria. That's a very small number of people. So they realized that they had to change what strength training was about. At most schools, strength training is about being stronger, bench pressing more and lifting more. At Stanford, strength training is about staying injury-free. Apart from injury-free being the right thing to do for players, it's also the strategic thing to do for Stanford because we don't have a very deep team. And so that keeps our best players on the field and not getting hurt. So the injury rate with Stanford, with Shannon Turley's system has gone down probably 80 or 90% the number of serious injuries at Stanford. So basically our guys are healthy because of the simple rules that Shannon uses around staying injury-free and also training to play your position, not just to lift mindlessly. So he's also got a couple of rules around specific things that he does depending upon whether you're a wide receiver or not. So it's about staying injury-free and the simple rules around doing that.
I must add, since we're talking about Stanford, I've been on the campus one time, and it's an amazingly large campus. Wow.
Yeah, right.
It just takes you away. I don't know if there's a campus any bigger than that in America. It's amazing.
Well, it was the Stanford family's farm. And so it's a huge campus plus the shopping center at Stanford plus the land over where Hewlett-Packard is headquartered at Stanford. I mean, yeah, we have a massive campus.
Let's break apart a little bit more of some of the detail. And you've seen simple rules from your perspective go through several incarnations. Why don't you go ahead and briefly describe Simple Rules 1.0, 2.0, and then let's break apart 3.0 in a little more detail.
Okay, well, 1.0 was really defining what the rules were. 2 to 5 rules, unique to you, focused on an activity. The second thing we realized was there's different kinds of rules. So, for example, there are boundary rules for picking what you're going to do when you have too many alternatives. So for example, Google had hiring rules for hiring computer scientists that were rules like hire unusual people, like someone who's done something eccentric. So we started to realize there were different kinds of rules, like boundary rules.
Explain that rule for a little bit more. Hiring people eccentric. People are listening. What do they put on their resume now if they want to get hired by Google?
There's a couple things. Yeah, they wanted to serve the right schools and that sort of stuff, but to really get the people they wanted, great Googlers, it was somebody eccentric. Like you had something like you rode a unicycle, you were a stay-at-home dad for a while, you backpacked in Africa for 6 months. It was things that were just different. And the idea was that you got more creative, that Google would be able to hire more creative computer scientists that way. That was a signal of creativity. The second thing they were looking for was references of other Googlers, because there the idea was Googlers know what a good Googler looks like, and they want to work with good Googlers. Therefore, they're going to pick out the right friends and refer them. And then the third thing, which maybe your listeners should know, is Google would reject you immediately if there were any kind of fudging or falsifying your resume, any little error in your resume, because Google felt that it was important to have high integrity people. So that was a way to screen out from the thousands of resumes who were a smaller number of people were really going to focus on an interview. So that was a set of rules that were around picking people, which are boundary rules.
I didn't mean to interrupt because I know you were going to move to, there's priority rules, how-to rules, timing rules, exit rules. I'm going to let you talk about them all.
No, I'm not going to talk about, you want me to talk about them all?
Oh, sure,
No.
sure.
Well, I don't know about that. I'll talk about some. But there's rules for picking, and there's also how-to rules of how you're going to do whatever it is you're doing. So I think one of my favorite examples is the White Stripes, the
band.
The band. I'm not quite sure how to describe them, what adjective quite captures them, but
eccentric. Eccentric captures them. Jack White is eccentric.
Yeah, they're a pretty crazy band. But they actually have rules that they're very proud of. And when they did their hit, The White Blood Cells, they had rules like no guitar solos, no blues, no bass. So just a few rules. Within that, they did 18 songs in 10 days, had an amazing album. So that's how-to rules. Those two kinds, boundary and how-to, tend to be pretty easy for people to learn. What's hard for people to learn is rules about time, rules about rhythm or sequence that you do things. So, for example, there was one company that we worked with that had a rule about product releases. In fact, we saw this very early in our stuff. A company that we release a new product every 9 months. And what that did was it synchronized marketing, engineering, and other parts of the company that had to work together. Pixar is another example where they are on a rhythm of a movie a year. So rules about time tend to be more sophisticated and harder to learn. We also, I'll go one last kind of rule. And that's the hardest kind of rule to learn is a stopping rule. We're all good at starting things. We're not good at stopping things, whether it's selling a stock, ending a relationship, stopping a partnership, whatever. And the stopping rules are hard to learn. We worked with one company that finally came up with it. They had partnering was their key process, and they had a rule for who to pick, but they also had a rule that said if our partner's not selling our product within 3 months, the partnership's over. So the stopping rules are particularly important. Hopefully gives you a little bit of a flavor of the rules, and why the rules. I'll tell you why the rules are important. The different kinds. We first learned there's different kinds. Then we learned that some are harder to learn than others. And then we learned that some are more closely related with performance. So the harder to learn rules, like stopping, like time, tend to be even more correlated with performance than other rules, like boundary rules.
You know, it's interesting. You bring up the exit stopping. In my world, that's investing world is pretty important. And I can think of a very well-known trader, and one of his favorite things he said to me, and he said this in public many times, the only thing I can control about the markets is how much I'm willing to lose. Every great trader, investor is really saying before they get into the market, I'm willing to lose this amount of money. What the average person doesn't understand is that is what the great trader is doing with their simple rules, whereas the average person might not necessarily think that that's the most important thing because they're more fixated on the money they can make versus the money they can lose, and they can control that with a simple rule.
Yes, that's right. I think, in fact, I'm trying to do it in my own portfolio, although it's so much easier to buy than to sell. But yeah, I know one very successful trader who's got a rule: if I lose 10% of my investment, I'm gone.
Yeah,
I sell.
Let me dig in one more little concept with you while I have you here, which we haven't talked about, which is the bottleneck. And so much of the simple rules are about getting through the bottleneck. You know, have an objective, get through the bottleneck, and then figure out these rules that really navigate the bottleneck. Why don't you talk about the bottleneck from your perspective?
The bottleneck is the middle step in the three-step process to create simple rules. The first is the objective. What do you want more of? What do you want less of? You want more revenue, lower costs, better health, whatever it is. That's usually easy for people to do. The second step, though, is the bottleneck. The bottleneck is what's keeping you from achieving whatever that objective is. For example, an interesting case recently is Netflix and the problem that they faced when content became expensive for them and they decided to do their own content. So the objective was, how do we do our own content that becomes very successful? So successful content was their objective. The bottleneck, as I thought about the bottleneck, what traditional media sees as the bottleneck in television, using the term television loosely, is great writing. Great writing is what makes The Sopranos a great show, The Mad Men a great show. The Netflix guys said, that's not a bottleneck that will win for us because everybody else has already solved that bottleneck. They went to a different bottleneck, which was directing and programming. So directing, essentially what they did was go to A-list directors that was really very unique on television, which then created a cinematic quality for what they did. So the bottleneck is the process that keeps you from getting the objective. In the case of Netflix, it was, let's go to directing and really solve that and put simple rules around that. If it's your personal health, it might be more exercise, but then it might be more weight loss. It's really up to you, or better eating rather. If it's, to go back to the Google example of computer scientists, that really came from looking at the fact they weren't getting the innovation they wanted and realizing the problem wasn't how they organized innovation, or the bottleneck wasn't how they organized innovation. The bottleneck was who they were hiring, and then so hiring became the bottleneck. So the bottleneck requires thought, real thought of what is really keeping me from what my objective is, and then once you've got that bottleneck solved, it's then fairly straightforward to come up with the rules.
It is just a fascinating topic area to dig through. It's going to keep you busy forever.
Well, it's keeping me pretty busy. Yeah, I'm having a good time with it, and it's. I think my life's better. I think my friends' lives are better, and hopefully other people have enjoyed reading the book.
Kathleen, where can we send people? The book Simple Rules is on Amazon. It's everywhere. Where else can we send people? You get your homepage at Stanford. They can find papers, etc. Is there another page we can send it to? Another website?
You can also send them to my co-author, Donald Sull, S-U-L-L, at MIT, and of course come to my webpage at Stanford.
Kathleen, thank you for taking the time today.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
Today's podcast is outside the box. Well, I guess I can make an argument that all of my podcasts are outside of the box. Amy Herman has a new book out called Visual Intelligence: Sharpen Your Perception, Change Your Life. Amy is all about art. Amy takes art, basically puts it in front of a classroom, and gets people to think differently. How could Monet's water lily paintings help save your company millions? Amy has an answer. Really cool insights, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Amy Herman. So Amy, I just got back from Taipei, Taiwan. I stayed at a hotel that I normally wouldn't want to stay in, a W hotel. They're fine, they're nice. I mean, I guess a cool place to be. I don't really like to be that cool. But before I had picked up your book, before I had dug into your book, I was laying in bed in this nice room, and I was thinking to myself, how many LED lights can I count that are on in this room? It must have been 20. I mean, so I'm making a note to myself. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's got to be a business here that I can have to block out LED lights when you go to hotel rooms.
Great.
So then, of course, I get into your book. Lo and behold, there's this soap story, and it turns out somebody's already doing something with LED lights. But I thought you might appreciate that I was sitting there before I even looked at your work, before I was familiar with your work. I was sitting there and feeling it already.
Well, that's great to hear, but it's also nice to know that you have that entrepreneurial spirit, thinking, how can I make a business out of this? But what you just described is so much of what I'm trying to convey in this book about not only seeing the big picture, but how we can fix the big picture by taking care of the small details.
Yeah, it's tough. We all just constantly walk on by so much of life. I tell you, I've got a lot of points here I want to talk about, but let's break apart a great big picture story that you talk about. We don't have to go in too much in depth, but just cover to let people understand what I already referred to it, the soap story. Explain that story. I think it's a great inroad into your world.
Well, I use it early on in the book because I think it is so illustrative of what you just talked about, how much we're missing and to a greater point, how much we take for granted. Derek Kayanga was an immigrant from Uganda who was staying in a hotel in the United States. He left his room and came back, and housekeeping had cleaned his room while he was gone. And when he went into the bathroom, he noticed that there was a brand new soap on the sink in a box. And he panicked, and he took the box of soap downstairs, and he said to the concierge, "Where's the soap from this morning?" And they said, "Well, sir, we replace the soap every day." And he said, "But I hadn't used up that soap. I don't want to be charged for a new soap." And the concierge explained to him that the soaps were replaced every day for every hotel guest, complimentary, and that he wasn't going to be charged for it. And he went upstairs to his room and he started to cry because he thought about how rare soap is in Uganda and how many people suffer for lack of hygiene, and there's just not enough soap to go around. And he said, how could they be so wasteful? Every single hotel guest, every single day, in every single hotel in the United States, how much soap is being wasted? And as a result of him not just seeing this as a waste, but turning it into opportunity, he started the Global Soap Project. It has expanded to 32 countries on multiple continents, and it has changed the hygiene and disease situation. It has improved hygiene and the prevention of disease, all because this man not only saw a situation, but he turned it around for the good. And it was about the big picture and an item that we take for granted every single day.
Now, you had not had the opportunity to train him. He was wise enough to already be down the path of being so observant, huh?
That's right. I did not train him, but when we told him about the book that I was writing, his story just fit so perfectly early on, because it's not just the idea of cops and doctors and people in the intelligence community being able to see more carefully. It's everyday people in their everyday world.
Let's dive into your backstory some. So here you are. I think people already understand that you want us to be more observant. There's so many things we're missing, and sometimes if you just have a fresh outlook, you can see so much. And that's kind of just the glossy view of this. But you have taken a very specific art historian, right?
Yes.
So you've taken a very specific task. I don't know. It's not a task. I mean, people, looking at art is something very enjoyable. But
right.
Looking at art and then connecting the dots. And there's actually science behind this. There's academic research behind this. Getting people to look at art and then finding that there's an increased awareness that you can actually stimulate and move yourself along the path towards being more aware. And there's so many benefits to this, of course. That's the flying high across the Pacific Ocean, 37,000 foot down look. How did you connect these dots? I mean, this is really out of left field.
It is and it isn't. I had studied art history in my undergraduate curriculum. I had an aha moment when I was a sophomore in college, and I saw these paintings, and they literally took my breath away. And as I pursued my legal studies, I went to law school, I was a corporate litigator, the idea that art is really powerful stayed with me. Art in itself is evocative and powerful, whether you have a trained eye or not. And the way I was able to connect the dots is I eventually changed my career and went from practicing law to museum education. But when I was in the museum education field, I realized art is not just for people who studied art history or have, an educated eye. It's so powerful that everyone responds to art. And when I started this program, it was not my idea. It actually came from Yale. The idea was to train medical students to look at works of art so they could bring those skills back to a clinical setting. And after doing that for a couple of years, I said, this is much bigger than medical students. Everybody needs to have good observation, perception, and communication skills. And art presents this incredible set of data. It's fresh. It's new. Most people haven't looked at works of art critically and in depth. And I realized that the skills that are involved in looking at works of art are readily, easily, and just almost without making a leap, you can transfer them to almost any profession. And that's when I started to expand the art of perception.
That very first moment where someone, and I'll mention my Taipei experience from just last week,
So it used to be the tallest building in the world. It's called Taipei 101. It still has the fastest elevators in the world. It's quite amazing. But you know what? I was so fascinated just to walk around this building from many vantages in the city and to take pictures and to observe it and to look and to think about all the details that had gone into this. But it's funny, before you see something, and this building I think many people could view as a piece of art, a very big piece, but before you see that piece of art and then you focus on it, I noticed in myself something happens. Once you say, okay, I'm going to focus on this, the concentration, and something starts to happen to me. And I don't know if it's the freshness of it, but then I know, I almost forced myself to take this trip because I knew I needed a kind of recharge, and it did exactly that. That's the really skimmed down version of where you go, but I think it's somewhat in your headspace, isn't it?
It's in your headspace, but it's also in your environment. I find I conduct about half of my classes in museums, and the other half I do in secured training sites and conference rooms. And I find while they're equally participatory and you learn in both kinds of sessions, when you change your mindset and you change your environment, you leave thinking differently. When I bring a group of surveillance agents to an art museum, they're out of their comfort zone and they're noticing things. They're not just looking at the works of art. They're looking at the frames. They're looking at how people are looking. They're looking at brushstroke. They're looking at what's installed around it. And my class is really not so much about finding answers, but how you ask questions. And your example of thinking about this building changed your focus. And there was probably a whole list of things you wanted to know, all these questions. So the program is about critical inquiry. And are we framing questions to elicit the information we need to do our jobs? So I use art as the data to think about framing questions, and then you transfer it right back to your job. So yeah, I agree with you. Looking at a work of art puts you in a different mindset. But when you're in a new environment like a museum, it changes your whole presence and your whole perspective.
Is half the battle when you first start this, and I want to go into some of these examples and talk about the art of perception that you've been running for a long time with medical students, but when you first, there's this, it just kind of overtakes you where you just calm down. There's a calming when you are put into this new environment. Like you said, it takes people out of their comfort zone, but there's a calming part to this. At least that's what I feel myself. Am I off base?
No, you're not off base at all. One of the things I think that has resonated over all these years, I keep asking myself, why is this program resonating with so many different people in so many different professions? And I've come to the conclusion there are two parts to it. The first is art is powerful. As I said, everyone sees something. No one can say, well, I don't know what you're talking about. All I ask is, what do you see? But the calming part comes from the fact that art is not threatening. I make it clear in each of my classes, there are no right and wrong answers here. Everybody sees things differently, and there are no judgments. I want to hear what you have to say. I want to hear your insights. And let's start with an even playing field, assuming that everyone in the class knows nothing about art, and we go from there. And one of the things that I do in every class is I ask all the participants to refrain from taking notes. And it's amazing the look of relief on their faces. I say that I prefer that you engage in looking at the works of art and in the dialogue instead of worrying about writing everything down. And the look of relief on their faces that all I'm asking of them is to look and tell me what they see. It creates almost immediate engagement. We end up having a great time, and people are very candid because I think looking at art is just not threatening.
You also have to get people to turn the phones off, right?
Yes, I do. And it's amazing because in the beginning of some of my classes, especially when the classes are mandatory, people are on their phones and looking and waiting. And then I put the slides up and the phones go down. And then I see the phones are turned off and then the phones are put away. It's really quite gratifying to watch that happen because there's no digital technology needed for my class. It's all about your eyes and your brain and your ability to communicate.
I think we all get so fascinated with technology. Technology is thinking for us and all this. And I still think it's pretty much bits and bytes. And it's like an advanced spreadsheet. I don't care how pretty the pictures look, but nothing beats the brain when it's in action.
That is correct. But, to write this book, I had to interview some neuroscientists because my publishers wanted somewhat of a scientific basis for what I was doing. And I said, but I'm not a scientist, but I was willing to do the research and lay the foundation, at least a layman's foundation of the science at work here. And the biggest takeaway that I had from talking to this Dr. Sebastian Sung at Princeton was when we were young and we learn about the eye, we learn about the retina and how it processes images and inverts the images. And he disabused me of a fact that I think, or an idea that most people have. The retina is not part of the eye, it's part of the brain.
It is the brain, right?
It is the brain. So by the time we're seeing images, our brain is already processing those images in the context of our associations and our experience. And yes, our prejudices and our biases. It's already being processed and channeled to a whole different place. It's not just a raw image of what we see. It's what do we think of it as well.
Leonardo da Vinci, knowing how to see. In your book, such a simple expression, knowing how to see. We all think, maybe instinctively, intuitively, we all think we know how to see, but it's just not the case, is it?
No, it is not. Da Vinci's phrase, sapere vedere, I always write it on a board in my room, in the classroom where I'm teaching, and I put a big X through it because I want to make it clear that I can't teach anybody how to see. Not only am I not qualified to do that, I'm not trained in optics or neuroscience or forensics, but what I can do and what I do using art as the data is what I call the 4 A's. 4 A's that I use to assess, to analyze, then we articulate the information, we speak, we delegate, we write a report, and then we adapt our behavior or we act. We make a decision based on the other 3. And in the last year, since I've written the book, I've added a 5th A for accountability. We are accountable for our decisions. So those are the skills that I work on. I really don't focus so much on how to see. I want to think about how do you observe, how do you perceive, and how do you communicate to be most effective in your profession.
So back in the day, though, your original training and programs, this was designed for medical students. I want you to explain that. But then you made a very clever, interesting pivot to where you got the NYPD involved. Why don't you talk about the early start with the medical students and how that evolved, and then talk about this pivot to bringing in detectives at NYPD. And I don't know how many people out there right now have ever heard that there's the possibility that cops in New York City have actually increased their perceptive abilities via studying art.
Thousands of them have, which is amazing. I'm happy to tell the story. It never ceases to amaze me to think about how this came about. When I was the head of education at the Frick Collection in New York City, I started the program. I mentioned that it was a program already established at the Yale Center for British Art in collaboration with Yale Medical School. The rationale underlying the program was take medical students out of the clinical setting, out of the medical school, bring them to the art museum, teach them to analyze works of art, not substantively, but to talk about what they observe so that when they go back to that clinical setting, they'll have a clearer view of their patients. They'll be able to look at their patients more clearly. I asked Yale's permission to start a similar program at the Frick Collection with our neighbor, Weill Cornell Medical School. And Yale said, absolutely, go ahead. So we started the program with the medical students, and it was wildly successful. We had waiting lists for the students, and it was covered in the New York Times. So we expanded to other medical schools. And by 2004, I started that program in 2000 at the Frick. And in 2004, I was out to dinner with some of my friends, and I was telling them about all these medical students that I worked with and what tunnel vision they had. And I wasn't saying it negatively. I just said that when you're a medical student, everything is in the context of diagnosis and physiology and anatomy. And their myopia was just overwhelming for me. They didn't know anything about art, which is fine, but their vision was so limited. And a friend at that dinner said to me, why are you just doing this for medical students? Why aren't you doing this for people who really need good observation skills? That was Saturday night. We were at the dinner. Monday morning, I decided, you're right, I should be doing this for homicide detectives. So I picked up the phone and I decided cold call the NYPD. So I picked up the phone and I said to the switchboard operator, hi, my name is Amy Herman. I'm the head of education at the Frick Collection, and I have a great idea. I train medical students to enhance their observation skills. I think it would be great for homicide detectives. Who should I speak to? There was dead silence on the other end of the phone. And I was transferred 7 times. Nobody knew who to put the art lady in touch with until I reached a deputy commissioner. And I knew that he knew what I was talking about because he said to me, Ms. Herman, if this is such a visual thing, why are we on the phone? So I invited him to the Frick collection with 7.
Why were you not knocking on his door? Go and see, as they say at Toyota, right?
Go and see, right. Well, he came to the Frick to see. He brought 7 colleagues from the New York City Police Training Academy. First time we ever had guns in the museum. And 6 months later, every newly promoted captain in the NYPD had to take this class at the Frick. And what was so amazing about it was it was absolutely natural. Every month I had a new class of captains. And then I got a call from the Wall Street Journal. And the reporter said, I understand you have cops at the Frick. What are you doing to them? As if something illicit was going on behind closed doors at the Frick collection. So I invited the Wall Street Journal reporter to come see what we were doing. And unbeknownst to me, she was going out into the precincts and the streets of New York City and asking these cops, how are you doing your job differently after learning to look at works of art with Amy at the Frick? And in July of 2005, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, column A1, it said, to master the art of solving crime, cops study Vermeer at the Frick. If I tell you that every inbox in my life exploded after that article, I got calls from agencies around the world, the FBI, the Department of Defense, the military, first responders, and they all said the same thing. Come teach us how to see like you did those cops in New York. And I said to them, I can't teach anyone how to see, but I explained about the 4 A's, and that's when the program really took off. I started working with CEOs and corporations and hospitals and U.S. special operations because we all realized that there was a much broader application to observation, perception, and inference and communication than just in the medical field, and that's how the program took off.
Take a law enforcement officer that you can think of, an example. You mentioned the general example of on the street and it's helped them. But give an example of perhaps someone that might have shared a story with you or how your training in the law enforcement field in particular really made a difference. Put some meat and flesh on those bones so we can kind of see it's more clearly.
Sure. 2 examples come to mind. One of them I talk about in the book. One of them I don't. The first example was a deputy sheriff in North Carolina. And I talk about a concept in my class. It's called the pertinent negative. It's talking about what you don't see in addition to what you do see to actually give a more accurate picture of what you're looking at. And this sheriff told me the story about a boat. They ruled it an accidental death where the boat turned over and the occupant of the boat fell underwater, drowned, hit the propeller. And the sheriff said when he was at the crime scene, something just didn't sit right with him. And he said, I thought about your class, Amy. And he said, I couldn't remember the name of what you called it. It was the pertinent negative, but something wasn't right. And I noticed that the papers, the registration papers in the boat weren't wet. He said, if the boat had turned over, then its contents would have spilled and those papers would have been wet and they weren't. And therefore the story didn't add up and the death ended up being ruled a homicide instead of an accident. He was able to put together the pieces of the methodology that I teach, apply it right to an investigation. The other example, which I thought was very interesting, there was someone who he was a detective late on a Saturday night in Brooklyn, and he got a call that they found a body, and the body was rolled up in a rug. He was called to the crime scene. The cops at the crime scene told him that they thought it was a prostitute from the neighborhood. And they said, we found her body. We believe it's the prostitute in the neighborhood. And he said they brought him to the crime scene. They unrolled the carpet in which her body had been stuffed. And he said, I remembered in Amy's class, she said, it's big picture and small details. And he said, I looked at the hair, the nails, and the toes. Freshly done hair, freshly manicured nails, freshly painted toes. He said, those weren't the telltale signs of a prostitute. And he said he told his team, this isn't a prostitute from the neighborhood. And it ended up being a missing graduate student from New York City who had been missing, and there was a high-profile search for her, and they found her. All because he looked at the small details on this bruised and beaten body, and he was able to make a determination that really contravened what his team thought. So it's the idea of small details, big picture, the pertinent negative, just different tools to use at the crime scene. And the other example is, I had a detective who took my class 3 times. And when he came in the 3rd time, I said, "Detective, I've seen you before. What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm really bad at this. And what your class made me realize is when I get a call to a crime scene, I've already envisioned in my head what that crime scene's going to look like before I even get there. And that's not the way to do my job."
You know, when you talk about small details, though, this is something I love to do. I love to look at human behavior, crowd psychology, all these different things, and neuroscience. And I had a ton of these guests on my podcast that you would surely know. You know, small details for the vast majority of people that go through life, sometimes to pay attention to the small details, to talk about the small details, is to go against the crowd, is to go against the system. And sometimes the crowd and the system can bite you if you point out things that perhaps shake up the apple cart.
You know, I agree with that, but part of me says you have to do your own thing. I mean, as a matter of personal safety, I've gotten out of situations when I've noticed small details that no one else sees, and I say, I'm getting out of this situation. I have friends from law school. One in particular, she's absolutely brilliant, and she refuses to see the small details. She says ignorance is bliss. She said, look how much more you worry about the world because of what you see. But I'd rather see all these small details and feel confident in my surroundings, because one of the concepts that I really focus on, especially in the intelligence community and law enforcement world, is the idea of situational awareness, both short-term and long-term. Where am I? What's happening? Who's around me? Am I safe? And long-term situational awareness is what's happening? What are the long-term problems? What are the long-term ramifications of the situations that I observe? And I agree, it does shake up the apple cart. And sometimes I'm one of those people who, when they say, see something, say something, I say something all the time because I always see something. You know, the law enforcement community is grateful to people because that's how we're going to combat the threats that face our world. We need the eyes of everyone to be looking around and to be aware of their surroundings.
You know, I'm thinking of an example that happened to me a few months ago. I was in Yangon, Myanmar, of all places. First time there, kind of landed late afternoon with my girlfriend, and we were kind of staying at a decent hotel. But we decided to do a walk outside. Well, Yangon doesn't really have a lot of streetlights. We got to an area where I've been around the block enough where I just kind of said to myself, this doesn't feel right. Maybe it was okay, but probabilistically in my mind, I knew situational awareness, things had just ratcheted up, and she starts making fun of me. She doesn't see anything wrong at all. But you know, it's one of those things when you've seen a little bit more, you start to lock it into the register. It doesn't mean you're being a worrywart or anything. And frankly, that's the only time that's happened to me, any time that I can remember recently. And it turns out there was no issue, but I knew that situation was different. I knew that it was in a place that was not necessarily perfectly safe.
Bravo for you, because I tell people to listen to that sixth sense because it's there for a reason. What happens is many people use the sixth sense in a professional context. And the problem is it's highly subjective, just as you said. You knew that something wasn't right, couldn't quite put your finger on it, but your situation changed, your surroundings changed. This light went on saying, you know what, we're not going to stick around here for too long. And so I talk about that sixth sense in the course. And what I tell the class participants is it's never enough in a professional context to say, you know, I had a really bad feeling, or my sixth sense told me don't go there. I tell people to listen to the sixth sense, but they need to be able to articulate with clarity and precision what that sixth sense is telling them. And I'll give you a real life example. In Berkeley, California, the kidnapping case of J.C. Dugard. She was kidnapped when she was 11 years old, held in captivity for 18 years, and her abductor fathered 2 children with her in the backyard and raised the kids in the backyard. It was really a tragic case. But I always use it as an example how they apprehended the abductor when he wasn't committing a crime. He was at the University of California, Berkeley campus, giving out religious literature, screaming about God and screaming obscenities, and it caught the eye of a police officer, and it gave her a bad feeling. She just had a sixth sense that this guy was up to no good. So she approached him, and she asked for his ID, which you can do in California, and she ran the ID, and it turns out he was on parole. So she called his parole officer, and this is what she said. She said, look, I've got your guy here. He's giving me a bad feeling. He's giving out religious literature. He's screaming about God. He's screaming obscenities, and he's got his 2 young daughters with him. What's his story? And the parole officer said to the police officer, this guy doesn't have any daughters. Who are the kids? So the parole officer gets on the phone and says to the guy, who are the 2 girls? And he really couldn't account for them. So they arranged to meet back at the man's house. And what did they find in the backyard? J.C. Dugard, where they had been raised. And that man and his wife were arrested. And now they're serving like 400 years of consecutive sentences for crimes against children, all because the police officer had a bad feeling about this man, but she needed to be able to articulate it to the parole officer to really put it all together and be able to apprehend him.
While we're in this space of crime, I want to ask about an example, and I would love for you to tell the story a little bit. So I was in the Washington, D.C. area, grew up in that area, and was there when Chandra Levy disappeared. And this was a big issue. She disappeared. It's a homicide, and she was kind of secretly dating a congressman, and everyone accused him of doing it, and it was a mess.
It was a mess.
You go into some details there that are really interesting. What I would love for you to do is to describe the detail that was missed. And not that you're going to try and say, hey, if they would have all taken my class, they would have figured it out. But I would love for you to kind of explain how you possibly could have got people to think differently about the Chandra Levy case, the detail they missed. You do cover that type of awareness in your training. You see where I'm trying to go.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example. And I use the example of the Chandra Levy case in all my classes, not just law enforcement, because it illustrates the importance of precise communication. And it illustrates the concept that every word counts. So as you said, Chandra Levy was a government intern. It was 2001. She was 21 years old, and I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, as a matter of fact, and she went running in Rock Creek Park. She went for a jog, and she was never seen again. She was murdered in the park, and the Washington Metropolitan Police Department initiated a search for her body. And this was a high-profile case, as you said, national spotlight, because she was involved with a congressman. And when the chief of detectives gave his instruction to the detectives and the recruits, it was a massive search because Rock Creek Park is so large and it was a big case. He gave his instruction to the recruits to search for Chandra Levy's body, and this is what he said. I want you to search 100 yards from every trail in Rock Creek Park. So when they transported all the detectives and recruits to the park, before they initiated the search, the instruction was repeated. But this time, the chief's instruction was, I want you to search 100 yards from every road in Rock Creek Park. The first time the instruction said 100 yards from every trail, and the second time it said 100 yards from every road. Now, for those people who are not familiar with Rock Creek Park, it's huge. There are thousands of trails, but only hundreds of roads. And no one questioned the inconsistency. They followed directions, and they searched 100 yards from every road in Rock Creek Park. It took 10 months until they found Chandra Levy's remains. Where were the remains when they found them? 79 yards from a trail. Now, in the time span of 10 months, what happens to a body? It decomposes, and any DNA evidence attached to it is gone. Now, I can't say with any certainty or confidence that had the instructions been given consistently, they would have found her body any sooner. The takeaway from that example is that you need to be consistent in your communications, in writing and in speaking, because somebody is listening to you. And the ramifications of that change, one word changed the entire scope of the investigation. And the defendant, it took 10 years to get a conviction in that case. And just this summer, that defendant made a motion for a new trial because there was no DNA evidence tying him to the scene of the crime. And so I remind my participants that one aspect of that criminal investigation, precise and consistent communication, is paramount. It's a very sad example of what can go wrong when we play with words. One word changed the whole scope.
As you say in your work, assume the other person can't see what you see. And if you assume that, then as you are being very precise with your words right now,
you have to be very precise. I mean, you have to go that extra mile. And as I was going through your work and reading the book, I was thinking, man, how many times have I screwed this up? It's almost common sense once you put yourself into that way of thinking, but obviously it's not so common.
I've said so many times, what I'm doing is not rocket science, but judging from the number of requests and inquiries I've had about my business, I realize people are not doing this. And the terms that I put it in, we need to lay the foundation, because I communicate based on the premise that people cannot see what I'm looking at. So you lay the foundation, lay the groundwork. Because if I'm sending an email to someone, the recipient of my email can't see what I see. There's always time to show how smart you are. There's always time to contextualize what you observe and talk about it and, apply it, precision, everything. But you need to lay the groundwork first. And what I'm noticing in all these groups that I'm working with, people have forgotten to lay the groundwork. They just want to jump in and show people how smart they are with the details and the nuance before really laying the foundation.
Hey, by the way, was this a fight to get this book built? Because this is really high quality stuff. I mean, seriously, I've written 5 books, so I know how hard it is to get nice paper and color pictures and all this kind of stuff, because I've not got it.
It was a big deal. I have to say, because the art is absolutely integral, my publishers did not want to make this an art book, and I understand that. It's not an art book, but I said quality reproduction of the art is absolutely critical, because that's the data that I use. And if I'm going to communicate my methodology, we need to have illustrative examples of what it is that I'm using to teach these participants. And so I'm very pleased with the quality of the paper. I wish the illustrations could have been bigger, but that's the art historian in me. I think the art serves its purpose of illustrating the points I'm trying to make.
Let me tie this to art some, because we've talked about some interesting examples, and I want to bring it back to, if people can imagine, okay, they're at a museum with you, they're in an art gallery with you, and you're going to start to walk people through the process. I'm actually in chapter 3 right now, and I'm looking at an interesting picture that before I knew what it was, it just kind of looks like a black and white, blurry kind of, like, I don't know, Rorschach test. I can't really tell what it is. And then a few pages later, I start to understand what it is when some context is given, and I can better see what it actually is. Talk about that process that's taking place in the brain, that when you don't know, you're perhaps looking, you think you're analyzing, you think you're taking in information, you're still not seeing, but then at some point in time the light happens, or the aha moment happens. Talk about that process with a particular piece of art. You can either go on the one that I just brought up, or you can pick another one.
Yeah, no, the one you brought up is a perfect example. I open every class with it. And the instruction that I give, I put the slide up on the screen and I say to the room, okay, put your right hand up in the air. And everyone raises his or her hand. And I say, put your hand down when you see something definitive and unequivocal that you could describe to someone who wasn't looking at this picture. Maybe 1 or 2 hands go down in a room of, say, 50 people. And then I say, for those of you who still have your hands up, I'm going to tell you what you're looking at in this picture is a mammal. And if you see a mammal definitively and unequivocally, you can put your hand down. And a few more hands go down. People aren't quite sure. And then the last clue that I give, I say, for those of you who still have your hands up, what you're looking at is a mammal with 4 legs. Maybe 1 or 2 more hands go down, but the majority of the hands remain in the air. So I tell them to all put their hands down, and then I reveal what they were looking at. And when you outline the picture, when I show the picture, it's actually a cow in the photograph. And I say, how many of you saw a cow? And very few hands go up. It's always fewer than 4 or 5. And the rest of the people did not see the cow at all. And the reason I start with this exercise is because a couple of years ago, I went to see a man named Apollo Robbins speak. Apollo Robbins was a professional con man. He started the evening, I attended with a friend of mine, and he started the evening with this exact exercise. And as soon as he put the slide up, he did the same thing. We had to raise our right hand, and he told us to put our hands down when we saw something definitive and unequivocal. And my friend put her hand down right away, immediately. And I was looking at the photograph, and I thought I saw a platypus or a kitten or an owl. I didn't know what the heck I was looking at. And my friend leaned over and said, I can't believe you don't see this. And first I was nervous, and then I started to sweat, because this is what I do for a living. I help people enhance their observation skills, and I saw nothing. And when he revealed the cow, I understood that my friend sitting next to me saw that cow immediately, and I could have looked at the slide for 20 minutes and never seen it. So I begin with the premise, and I carry it through the entire course. No two people see anything the same way, and we can't take it for granted that we do. Nobody sees the world the way you do physically, and quite often, two people are going to walk away from the same situation with fundamentally different perceptions of what they've just seen, and my course gives you the tools to try to reconcile those differences.
You know, there might be the smarty pants person sitting out there. I'm not saying it's me, but the smarty pants person that's saying, well, why do I'm not discounting, or I'm not saying that Amy's not right with these ideas, but the process of going through the exercise, I could see that there could be some people that perhaps think they can hack it, or they don't have to, as you say in your book, go and see. They want to get to the aha moment faster, quicker, without having to do the work. Do you bump into that some?
I do. One example comes to mind, and in the 14 years that I've been teaching this class, I had one experience with this, and it just stayed in my brain. I put that exact slide up, and when I revealed the cow, everyone in the class was just, oh my goodness, how did I not see this? And one man crossed his arms across his body, and he looked really perturbed. And I said, is something wrong? Do you not see the cow? And you know what he said? He said, you're trying to trick me. He said, why should I listen to anything you have to say? He said, you're trying to trick me and show my weaknesses. And he was actually in sales. And I said, I'm not trying to trick you. I'm trying to show you that there are multiple ways to see everything, that multiple perspectives make for better decision making. And if you're involved in sales, you need to know that your clients may see things differently than you do. And it would behoove you to recognize that there are multiple perspectives. And he wouldn't budge. He said, no, you're trying to trick me and bring out my weaknesses, and I'm just not going to go for it. One time it happened in all these years.
You are trying to kick everybody off the autopilot.
Yes, I am.
To walk down the street and try and observe the same street that you might walk down every day, and try and observe something different every day.
Yes, I do. And I was just speaking yesterday. I was at a book signing, and I think I gave the example. I had a group of pharmaceutical professionals from France a couple of years ago, and it was a 2-part course. It was the morning of a Thursday and the morning of a Friday. And at the end of the course on Thursday, I said, I want you to notice one thing between tonight and tomorrow that you wouldn't have noticed before, and we're going to talk about it tomorrow morning. And when they came back on Friday morning, we went around the room, and I said, okay, what did you notice? And it was in New York City. So there are myriad things to observe in a 24-hour period. And one of the executives raised his hand. He said, I was at breakfast this morning, and I never noticed how much Americans take at a breakfast buffet. So that wasn't quite what I had in mind, but you know what? Whatever it is that we notice, it's one more thing than we saw the day before.
Do you have any in this, even though I'm currently in Asia right now, but I catch a decent bit of CNN, because I'm always, as a former political science major, I'm always curious to watch the machinations going on in America. I don't think of the major candidates that were left standing, even though literally we had got to the point where some of them were now being referred to as serial killers. I don't think any of the major candidates left standing were like, they'll have families, they have kids, they've gone to school, they're not killers. But it really is amazing how we have taken things to a level where we do have the blinders on. If that person fits what we think of as the bad guy or the good guy, no other detail really matters. We've got the blinders on, and that's it. And our perception, it doesn't exist.
It reminds me of the line that I tell my son all the time, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. Our perceptions, it's very, very difficult to undo your perceptions. But what I have found, one of the things that I think is powerful about this course is when I use art as the data to show people how we can change our perceptions by stepping back and looking at the big picture and thinking about what we might be missing, I'm hoping that those very same skills can be used in a problem-solving context when you're ready to say, okay, this is how we're going to solve the problem. Here's the issue. Here's how we're going to solve it. I'm done. What I'd rather you do is say, here's the problem. This is what I think might be most effective, but then collaborate and ask your colleagues. I use that method of COBRA. I don't know if you've gotten to it yet in the book.
Camouflaged, one, break, realign, and ask.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. I use the COBRA methodology to step back from problems that we can't necessarily solve, where we hit a wall and we get frustrated. The camouflage, you say, is there any hidden issue here that I might not see? Step back and say, what's camouflaged here? What's the problem? Then you take one issue at a time. We all know about the problems of multitasking. Focus in on this one problem. If you still can't get an answer, take a break, walk away, take a walk, do something else, give your brain a chance to refresh and rethink the inquiry so you're not focused on it all the time. When you come back, realign your expectations and say, you know what, if I can't get to this result, maybe there's a different means to the end. And finally, ask someone else. Say, here's the problem I've run into. Here are the factors. Here's the issue. Is there something you see that I don't? And I find that I'm not trying to add a burden to anyone's problem-solving mechanism, but I find that if they can use this COBRA methodology, it's kind of a great way to address a problem from a different angle.
Huge competitive edge to thinking this way.
I think so. I hope so.
A couple of the points, though, too, that I really took away, at least things that but it's kind of a nice reminder, and, challenging assumptions, not assuming, and realizing so often perhaps the solution is like staring at you, right back at you, hiding in plain sight. So much of this, and you quote a couple guys that I've actually had on my show, Dan Simons and Chris Chabris. I mean, the inattentional blindness.
It's huge.
This exists all day long, all around us, and never stops.
It does. It exists everywhere and in every profession. What I'm trying to do is not just point out this problem of inattentional blindness and our inability to see things the way other people see and to miss what's hiding in plain sight, but to give you tangible tools to be able to overcome these obstacles in a professional and a personal context, to be able to say, I miss this all the time. What can I do so that I don't miss it next time? Because I have countless examples in the book of people that are missing what's hiding in plain sight. And I agree with you. I think it gives them a huge competitive advantage.
Well, not to try and sell books for you directly, but I will have to say we can talk about pictures, we can talk about photographs, we can talk about images of famous art, but until you look at it, our conversation doesn't add all that you need. So I think for those that are curious and those that have been inspired today, I really think that they should definitely take a look. I mean, it's one of those things like, look, sometimes it only takes just a half a day or a couple days of reading, and all of a sudden you're kind of like, wow, okay, that's a change. Can I have a new inspiration? And that's all we're looking for at any given point in time, I think.
I agree. And I say that when people take my class and hopefully read my book, I'm going to apply the same idea. If one person changes the way they look at the world, then I've done my work. If one person changes the way they see their work and they see their world, and there's a behavioral alteration based on their observations, then I've been successful in this endeavor. And that's what I hope, not only for the people that take my class, but those who read Visual Intelligence as well.
Visual Intelligence, it is everywhere, I assume?
Yes, it is everywhere.
I have to say, I definitely did not do it justice in terms of all the detail, because this is a fairly thick book. It's not a 1 hour read by any stretch of the imagination. For those people out there that have been reading these business books that are about 10,000 words and really don't say anything, this is going to require, as one might imagine with the title Visual Intelligence, it's going to require a little intelligence to get through it. But that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think it is a good thing. A quality read is a good thing.
Yeah. Hey, Amy, where can we send people to, obviously Amazon and all that kind of fun stuff, to buy the book? Do you have a website where you want people to go to?
If people want to read more about the program and the training and the book, it's artfulperception.com, www.artfulperception.com.
Okay, you have to promise me the next time that I'm in New York City that I can sit in a class and I can observe this process. I now that I'm curious, because I can't just do it through a book alone. I have to come there and see you.
It would be a pleasure. You can sit in with my cops anytime.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced,
college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money. Trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.